Declassified documents rarely shock historians, but this one did. In 1994, when previously sealed occupation memos were released under U.S. Public Law 102-138, historians found something strange, a conversation, a short one, barely a paragraph, but powerful enough to reshape Asia for 80 years. The memo described a private moment inside the general headquarters in Tokyo, a moment that officials once called too sensitive for release. It recorded a single sentence spoken by General Douglas MacArthur, a sentence so quietly delivered that one witness wrote, "No one believed he was serious, but he was rewriting the future of Japan as he spoke." That sentence would become Article 9 of Japan's post-war constitution, the clause that renounced war forever. It would transform the world's most feared imperial military into a nation legally bound to peace. But here's the part almost no one knows. Article 9 was not the result of a long debate, not the outcome of diplomatic negotiation, not the product of Japanese political consensus. It began with a quiet sentence inside a closed room in 1946. For decades, scholars and governments would argue about who proposed it, why was it pushed? Was it forced on Japan? Was it a strategic move against the Soviets or a moral act by a victorious commander? But to understand that sentence and why it still divides Japan in 2025 we must go back to the nightmarish days when an empire fell and a nation waited to hear its fate. This is not simply the story of a law. It is the story of a country stripped to its bones, and a general who believed he could rebuild it with a pencil. A story hidden behind sealed doors, withheld documents, and political fog. And it begins with Japan. Burning. Japan's defeat in 1945 was not the end of a war. It was the collapse of a world. By August, American firebombing had destroyed 40% of Japan's urban area. Entire neighborhoods in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya were reduced to charred grids. Cities were gone. Not damaged, gone. Factories empty. Food stocks depleted, railways shattered, children digging through rubble for scraps of metal to sell. The emperor's surrender broadcast. A recording distorted by static dash shocked the population. For decades, they had been told Japan was invincible. They believed surrender was impossible. They believed the emperor was a living god. And yet, his voice trembled as he announced, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage." Millions cried. Others knelt in silence. Some refused to believe the war was over. Inside this devastated nation, one figure now held ultimate authority: General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. When he landed at Atsugi Airfield, he walked through a silent crowd of stunned Japanese soldiers. They expected a conqueror. What they got was a man who didn't even carry a gun. Because MacArthur understood something critical. Japan could be rebuilt, but only if its people accepted the occupation and accepted him. Yet beneath the calm exterior, GHQ faced a crisis: Japan's pre-war constitution. The Meiji Constitution of 1889 still empowered the emperor to command the armed forces, meaning Japan, legally, could rearm at any time. Even as American troops occupied Tokyo, the legal foundation for a future Japanese army still existed, untouched. To Washington, this was unacceptable. To MacArthur, it was dangerous. Japan's militarists were crushed, but not extinct. Many had blended back into civilian life. Some still held influence. And with the Soviet Union expanding into Asia, the risk of Japan remilitarizing under new ideological pressure was real. MacArthur believed Japan needed something more drastic, something irreversible, something that would make another war impossible. He wanted a new constitution, a modern one, democratic, Western style, one that removed the emperor from political power, protected civil rights, and shattered the legal framework of militarism. But the Japanese government thought otherwise. They believed the Constitution only needed minor revisions. They wanted to preserve the emperor's prestige. They wanted to maintain the right to self-defense. And in early 1946, it seemed the two sides were drifting toward conflict, until a single meeting changed everything. February 3rd, 1946. Cold wind pressed against the windows of the Daiichi building, MacArthur's Tokyo headquarters. Inside, the mood was tense. MacArthur had summoned his legal team, Major General Courtney Whitney, Colonel Charles Cades, Lieutenant Colonel Milo Rowell, and a selected group of SCAP legal officers. All of them expected a discussion. What they got was a declaration. MacArthur entered the room holding a single sheet of paper. Whitney later recalled, "He did not sit, he stood, and when MacArthur stood, everyone became very still." MacArthur told them Japan had submitted a proposed revision of its old constitution. He said it was completely unacceptable. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "If the Japanese cannot write a suitable constitution, we will write it for them." He handed Whitney the paper. 3 points? Just 3. The second point was the one that froze the room. It read, "Japan renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation." Silence. MacArthur continued, "Japan will maintain no armed forces, land, sea, or air." This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even a policy. It was an order. Whitney later said, "I felt chills. No nation had ever done this. No commander had ever imposed this." Cades thought it was impractical. Rowell thought Washington might reject it. But MacArthur's voice made it clear. He was not asking for approval. He believed Japan, a nation that had unleashed devastation across Asia, had to be rebuilt from its moral core. And that meant the right to wage war had to be removed, not reduced, not limited, removed. Whitney's notes described MacArthur's tone as quiet, final, unshakable. That quiet sentence, the one spoken as if it were an administrative detail, would become Article 9, but the Japanese reaction, explosive. The draft arrived quietly, a sealed envelope, delivered by GHQ officers, escorted by MPs, stamped with SCAP authority. Inside the Prime Minister's residence, Japanese officials gathered to read what they thought would be a set of mild constitutional suggestions. What they found instead was political thunder. Foreign Minister Shigeru Yoshida read the document first. He reached Article 9, stopped, read it again, then looked up, his face pale. He whispered, This is unprecedented." The room erupted. Senior bureaucrats leaned over the table, pointing at the lines. Military-era officials, now technically civilians, shook their heads in disbelief. Some stood up in anger. Later testimonies describe phrases like, "A nation cannot exist without arms. This abolishes sovereignty. Impossible. Completely impossible. No country has done this. Why should Japan? This will leave us defenseless against Russia." Yoshida said nothing. He kept reading, because buried beneath the shock was a truth Japanese leaders rarely admitted. They had no leverage. Japan was occupied, disarmed, starving, and traumatized. GHQ controlled food imports, police oversight, industry recovery, political vetting, media censorship. If Japan refused MacArthur's draft, the consequences were unpredictable. Prime Minister Kujiro Shidehara arrived moments later. Yoshida handed him the document. Shidehara adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and began reading silently. Witnesses expected him to explode, but instead, he surprised everyone. After several minutes, Shidehara placed the document down and said calmly, "Perhaps this is the direction Japan needs." The room fell silent. Officials stared at him as if he had lost his mind. One shouted, "Prime Minister without an army! How will we protect Japan?" Shidehara replied, "If we reject this, what will we become?" He believed Japan had one chance to regain international trust, one chance to rebuild its moral identity, one chance to break with the military caste that had dominated the nation for generations. Shidehara believed Article 9 was not humiliation. He believed it was salvation. But he also understood the danger. Accepting the clause could be seen as surrendering Japan's sovereignty. Rejecting the clause could provoke GHQ, or worse, provoke the Soviets, who were watching Japan's reconstruction with predatory interest. Shidehara made a strategic gamble. He said, "Let this be Japan's gift to the world," a statement both idealistic and subtly practical. Because by accepting Article 9, Japan could shift blame for its demilitarization to the Americans, while gaining room to rebuild its economy without military spending. But that reasoning didn't quiet the room. Many officials objected violently. One senior bureaucrat slammed his fist against the table. "The people will never accept this." But he was wrong. The people were exhausted. They had watched husbands, brothers, and sons vanish. Consumed by a war their government told them was glorious. What they saw instead was starvation, burned cities, widows, orphans, mass graves, endless funerals. For many Japanese civilians, a constitutional promise of peace felt like a blessing. But internally, in government circles, resistance remained fierce. The biggest question was this: was Article 9 forced on Japan, or did Japanese leaders secretly agree with it? Historians still debate this. What is certain is this: Shidehara supported it. Yoshida accepted it. The cabinet resisted but ultimately complied. However, they inserted one line that would change everything decades later in order to accomplish the aims of the preceding paragraph. This line, small, almost invisible, would become the legal opening that allowed the creation of the self-defense forces in 1954. But in early 1946, the focus wasn't on future loopholes. It was on the present crisis. MacArthur wanted the Constitution drafted in 1 week, an impossible deadline, a political earthquake, and for Japan, a test of survival. February 4th to 12th, 1946. Historians call it the Miracle Week. In just 7 days, a small team of American lawyers, officers, and secretaries, most of whom had never written a constitution before, created the foundation of modern Japan. Inside the Daiichi building, Whitney and Cades assembled drafting groups: civil rights team, legislative structure team, judiciary team, emperor's roll team. And the team assigned one of the most difficult tasks ever attempted: writing Article 9. Colonel Charles Cades led this part. He was stunned by MacArthur's demand. He considered it unrealistic. But MacArthur gave 3 reasons. 1. Moral responsibility. Japan had suffered devastation almost unimaginable. A commitment to peace would prevent future militarists from rising. 2nd, international legitimacy. A pacifist Japan would regain trust from nations it once invaded. 3rd, strategic pressure on the Soviet Union. Japan without an army could not be seized or manipulated by Soviet influence. Cades later said, MacArthur saw Article 9 as Japan's shield, moral and strategic. So the drafting began. The language evolved from Japan renounces war to the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. The team added, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. They added the phrase, forever. Not metaphorically, literally. This was not temporary, not conditional, not dependent on circumstances. Japan would renounce war permanently. The work was exhausting, draft after draft, night after night, typing, revising, debating, consulting international legal precedents, even though none existed for such a clause. Minutes from the meetings describe frustration impossible to enforce. No other state has done this. Too idealistic for constitutional law. How do we define war potential? But MacArthur was resolute. The drafting team wrote the clause dozens of times, each version slightly refined. On February 13th, 1946, the final English draft was complete. Now came the real test. Would the Japanese government accept it? And even if they did, could the Japanese Diet approve it? And even if that happened, would the Japanese people accept it as their new national identity? No one knew. But the next confrontation, the next clash of wills, would determine the fate of Article 9. Because when the Japanese negotiating delegation saw the final English draft, their reaction was nothing short of volcanic. February 22nd, 1946. A cold, gray morning in Tokyo. The Japanese government delegation arrived at GHQ headquarters with stiff faces and thick folders filled with objections. They expected negotiation, compromise, maybe even some room to maneuver. They were wrong. The Americans presented the final English draft. Not a suggestion, not a proposal, but a finished constitution, including Article 9 exactly as written by Cades's team. The Japanese delegates were stunned. One witness recalled, "We realized in that moment that MacArthur would accept nothing less than full adoption." The first objection came quickly. A senior Japanese official, his voice trembling with anger, said, "A nation cannot exist without forces for self-defense. This clause is impossible." Whitney replied calmly, "Japan can rely on the collective will of peaceful nations." The answer sounded noble. But Japan knew the world was anything but peaceful. The Soviets had just seized the Kuril Islands. U.S.-Soviet relations were deteriorating rapidly in Europe. Communist movements across Asia were gaining strength. Another Japanese official pressed the issue, "What if we are attacked?" Whitney answered, "Then the United Nations will protect you." It was a diplomatic line, not a guarantee. The Japanese delegates were unconvinced. They argued Article 9 violated national sovereignty. They argued Japan needed minimal forces for internal security. They argued no other nation had ever been asked to do this. But MacArthur's staff had a strategic advantage. They controlled the negotiation. Documents from the meeting show that every major Japanese objection was rejected in minutes. One line from the notes stands out. GHQ did not intend to debate. They intended to finalize. The Japanese delegation left GHQ shaken. They returned to the Prime Minister with a grim message. "The Americans will not bend." Shidehara listened silently. Then he made a decision that changed the course of the negotiation and history. He announced that the Japanese government would accept the American draft, including Article 9. The reaction inside the cabinet was explosive. Ministers shouted, some pounded the table, others warned that Japan was being stripped of dignity and sovereignty. But Shidehara saw something larger. He believed Article 9 could serve as a moral stance distancing Japan from its militarist past, a strategic shield preventing entanglement in Cold War conflicts, and a diplomatic bridge to rebuild trust with Asian nations Japan once occupied. He said, "Japan cannot return to what it once was. Peace is the only path forward." And with that, the government, reluctantly, painfully, moved toward accepting the unthinkable, a constitution renouncing war forever. But GHQ still needed the Japanese Diet, the elected legislature, to approve it. And that confrontation would make everything so far look easy. The Diet debates in 1946 were some of the most emotionally charged in Japanese history. Newspapers reported scenes of shouting matches, furious questioning, speeches that lasted hours, accusations of American coercion, warnings Japan would become a protectorate without honor. But something unexpected happened when Article 9 was read aloud. The public gallery went silent. Then many civilians watching applauded. The people, unlike many politicians, had lived the horror of the war firsthand. They had seen homes burned, children buried, soldiers returning limbless, families destroyed, cities flattened into rubble. For millions of ordinary Japanese, Article 9 felt like a promise that their sons would never be sent to die again. But opposition inside the Diet remained fierce. One legislator argued, "A Japan without arms is a Japan at the mercy of foreign powers." Another said, "We cannot abandon the right to self-defense. No government has the right to do this." And one raised a point that would haunt Japan for decades. If America wants Japan unarmed now, what will happen when America no longer protects us? It was a question no one could answer. MacArthur watched the debates closely. He was careful not to appear to force the decision. He allowed Japanese legislators to argue among themselves. But quietly, behind the scenes, GHQ strongly encouraged passage. Reports note phone calls, private discussions, informal pressure, political guidance. Not illegal, but far from neutral. By mid-1946, it became clear Article 9 would pass, but not because politicians were united, not because GHQ forced it overtly. It passed because the public overwhelmingly supported it. Polls showed civilians favored peace, mothers wanted no draft, teachers supported demilitarization, doctors, monks, farmers, nearly all preferred stability over war. Japan had lost 3 million lives. No one wanted another catastrophe. The Diet voted on November 3, 1946, and the new Constitution, including Article 9, was approved. It was promulgated the same day, and 6 months later, on May 3, 1947, it officially took effect. For the first time in modern history, a major nation had voluntarily given up the right to wage war. But then, history played a trick. Barely 3 years later, everything changed again. Japan's peace pledge had barely taken root when war erupted on the Korean Peninsula in June 1950. The United States, now leading United Nations forces, realized something devastating. They had demanded a permanently demilitarized Japan. Just before Asia descended into war, American commanders urgently needed troops, bases, logistics, repairs, and supply lines. Japan's proximity to Korea made it strategically priceless. Washington sent new orders to Tokyo. Japan must rearm. The reaction inside GHQ was almost surreal. For years, MacArthur's staff had enforced Article 9. Now the U.S. wanted Japan to reverse it. Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru was furious. He pointed at Article 9 and said plainly, "This is your doing. Japan cannot rearm it. You forbade it." But the U.S. insisted. Not for Japan's sake, for America's. SCAP ordered Japan to create a new force, the National Police Reserve. 75,000 men, trained, armed, and effectively the nucleus of a future army. To justify this, GHQ created a legal fiction. This new force was not a military, it was a police reserve. Even though it had infantry, had heavy weapons, trained like the army, served military purposes. This was the birth of Japan's modern self-defense forces. But the irony was astounding. MacArthur had demanded Japan renounce war. Now America demanded Japan rearm. Against communist expansion. Article 9 remained unchanged on paper, but its interpretation began to evolve. A constitutional clause meant as a shield against militarism was now becoming a legal battleground for decades of political struggle. Japan's identity split into two halves: the promise, a nation of peace, forever renouncing war; the reality, a nation forced to defend itself in a dangerous Cold War world. To reconcile the contradiction, Japan developed a doctrine: minimum necessary self-defense. But what is minimum? Who decides necessary? Those questions led to political storms that would continue into 2025. By the early 1950s, Article 9 was no longer a simple ideal. It was a living contradiction, a pacifist clause in a militarizing world. Japan now existed in two realities. Legally, a nation that renounced war forever, practically a nation building forces to defend itself. The U.S. pushed for more military cooperation. The Soviets denounced Japan as a puppet of American militarism. China accused Japan of preparing for revival of aggression. Japan's own people were torn between hope and fear. This tension, born from one quiet sentence, would shape Japan's politics, identity, and diplomacy for the next 8 decades. And by 2025, that tension would erupt again, because Article 9 was not just a law. It was a mirror, reflecting everything Japan feared becoming, and everything Japan wished to be. A single sentence had changed a nation, but the world would continue to test that promise again and again. How a peace clause became a legal battlefield. After the Korean War erupted, the United States realized Japan could never remain truly demilitarized. The Cold War was tightening around Asia. China had turned communist. The Soviet Union had tested atomic weapons. North Korea had invaded the South. Southeast Asia was destabilizing. Washington needed Japan, not as a conquered nation, but as a regional anchor against Soviet and Chinese influence. Thus began the reinterpretation era, one of the most controversial phases in Japanese constitutional history. Japan officially created the Japan Self-Defense Forces, JSDF. Not an army, not a navy, not an air force, but in practice, all three. To justify the move without violating Article 9, the Japanese cabinet introduced a line of reasoning that would haunt politics for 70 years. Article 9 only forbids offensive war. This was the first reinterpretation, not a revision, not an amendment, a reinterpretation. The government argued, war potential equals offensive capability. Forces exclusively for defense equals legal. SDF weapons were non-offensive. Japan could use force only if attacked first. This reasoning was controversial, but it stuck. Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida adopted a long-term strategy. Japan would rely on the U.S. for security. Japan would keep its own military small. Japan would focus national resources on economic reconstruction. This doctrine allowed Japan to become an economic powerhouse. Yet, it also made Japan dependent on the U.S. for defense a dependency that critics call a strategic weakness, even today. The rise of the SDF triggered massive public protests throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Tens of thousands marched under banners reading, "Defend Article 9! No more war! Remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki!" Japan was a nation traumatized. Many citizens feared any military force, no matter how small, could lead to the rise of militarism again. The emotional divide between memory and necessity became the heart of Japan's internal struggle. The clause tested by law, politics, and reality. By the 1970s, Japan's economy was booming. Its military technology was quietly modernizing. But Article 9 still hung over every major decision. The Japanese Supreme Court was forced to clarify what Article 9 actually meant. The most important ruling came in 1959, but shaped debates for decades. The Tsunakawa case, 1959. Plaintiffs argued the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was unconstitutional because hosting American bases implied participation in war. The court delivered a stunning statement. Article 9 does not deny Japan the right to self-defense. This line became the legal foundation for every reinterpretation afterward. Judges admitted Article 9 was vague, but they concluded Japan must retain the ability to protect its own existence. The ruling, effectively confirmed, SDF are constitutional. Hosting U.S. forces is legal. Collective defense measures can be justified. This was the second great reinterpretation. 1970s, the rise of defense spending ceilings. To reassure the public, the government announced, Japan will never spend more than 1% of GDP on defense. Japan will never possess offensive weapons like nuclear missiles or bombers. But the world was changing fast. China was rising. The Soviet Pacific Fleet was expanding. North Korea was becoming more unpredictable. Japan's promise of minimal defense began to clash with regional realities. Peacekeeping, pressure, and the global stage. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Japan faced a new question. If the Cold War was over, why did Japan still need to stay militarily constrained? The Gulf War, 1991. Japan contributed $13 billion in financial support, but sent no troops. The world mocked Japan's role as checkbook diplomacy. The criticism stung deeply. Japan realized its pacifist stance limited its international influence. 1992. The PKO Law. For the first time since 1945, Japanese forces participated in overseas operations. Not combat, but peacekeeping missions. Cambodia, Mozambique, Timor-Leste, Golan Heights. These missions marked a historic turning point. Japan was no longer pacifist in practice, only in constitutional language. The North Korean threat. The 1998 North Korean missile flyover shook Japan. It revealed that Article 9's restrictions left Japan vulnerable to modern threats. Missile attacks, nuclear development, cyber warfare. Public sentiment began shifting. Younger generations, born long after the war, questioned whether strict pacifism was still realistic. Suddenly, the question was no longer, how do we uphold Article 9? It became, how do we survive with Article 9? A new world, old restrictions. The post-9/11 era brought global instability, terrorism, naval confrontations, missile proliferation, expanding Chinese military presence, North Korea's nuclear tests. Japan's pacifist identity was now under direct pressure. 2004, Iraq deployment. Japan sent SDF troops overseas for non-combat reconstruction support. Although heavily restricted, it represented the most assertive use of Japan's forces since 1945. Debate exploded inside Japan. Supporters said Japan should contribute to global stability. Critics said even non-combat roles violated Article 9. 2014. Abe's historic reinterpretation. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made the most controversial move in Article 9 history. He reinterpreted the Constitution to allow collective self-defense, meaning Japan could use force not only when Japan is attacked, but also when an ally, such as the U.S., is attacked, and Japan's survival is threatened. This was the third major reinterpretation and the largest expansion of Japan's military role since 1954. Protesters flooded the streets, some of the biggest demonstrations in post-war history. But Abe argued, if Japan cannot defend its allies, Japan cannot expect to be defended in return. The reinterpretation was approved. Japan now had one foot in its pacifist past and one foot in a militarized present. By the 2010s, Japan's relationship with Article 9 was deeply conflicted. Article 9 remained untouched. A sacred text, a moral promise, a symbol of rebirth after catastrophe. But Japan's security environment, North Korean nukes, Chinese expansion, Russian naval movements, forced the country into increasingly assertive defense postures. Japan had built one of the world's most advanced militaries. Without ever calling it an army, it had become a global peacekeeper. While legally constrained from war, it had reinterpreted a constitution it had never revised. And as 2025 approached, the question was no longer academic, legal, or symbolic. It was survival. Would Japan hold on to its permanent peace pledge, or would the world force Japan to rewrite the clause born from one quiet sentence? A promise made in 1946 meets a world on fire. By 2025, Article 9, once seen as the soul of modern Japan, had become the center of the most intense political battle the nation had faced in decades. Not because Japan wanted war, not because Japan wanted to abandon its pacifist identity, but because the world around Japan had changed faster and more dangerously than Article 9 could accommodate. This chapter opens with a truth that Japanese policymakers now admit privately. Japan's security situation in 2025 is the worst since 1945. And this time, there is no MacArthur, no GHQ, no occupation authority to dictate a solution. Japan must decide for itself. The pressures Japan faces in 2025. 3 strategic fronts now press against Japan simultaneously. 1. China's expanding military presence. The People's Liberation Army Navy, one of the fastest-growing naval forces on Earth, operates aggressively in the East China Sea. Chinese vessels regularly approach the Senkaku Islands. Jets challenge Japanese airspace. Missile tests fall near Japanese waters. Satellite photos show more Chinese carriers conducting mock strike drills. Submarines operating in the Philippine Sea. Long-range missile systems pointed at U.S.-Japan bases. For the first time since 1945, Japanese defense officials publicly discussed the possibility of a direct clash. 2. North Korea's missile program. Between 2016 and 2024, North Korea conducted more missile tests than in the previous decade combined. Some flew directly over Japan. Others landed inside Japan's exclusive economic zone. But the biggest shock came in 2023, when North Korea tested a solid-fuel ICBM - far harder to detect and intercept. Japan's missile defense doctrine, built on the assumption of early warning time, was shaken. In 2025, Japanese newspapers asked a question that would have been unthinkable in the 1980s. Can Article 9 protect us from nuclear missiles? 3. Russia's resurgence in the Pacific. While the world watched Russia's actions in Europe, Tokyo quietly observed something else. Russia expanding Pacific Fleet operations, new naval deployments around Hokkaido, joint exercises with China near disputed waters, missile-capable bombers flying near Japan's air defense zone. For decades, post-Soviet Russia was seen as a secondary concern. Not anymore. Japan now faces a two-front nuclear threat, plus a territorial adversary with the world's largest army. And this is where the crisis becomes unavoidable. Article 9 was written for a world that no longer exists. Japan's internal battle, a nation split in two. Polls in 2025 reveal a generational divide unlike any in post-war Japan. Older generations, 60 plus. Grew up hearing stories of the war firsthand, the firebombing, the atomic attacks, famine, soldiers never returning. For them, Article 9 is sacred, a lifeline, a moral beacon. They fear that any revision, could open the door to militarism. Younger generations, 18 to 35, grew up in a Japan that is wealthy, technologically advanced, globally respected, but surrounded by nuclear powers. For them, Article 9 feels outdated, a noble ideal that does not protect them from real threats. One student stated during a 2025 street interview, "Pacifism doesn't stop missiles." Another said, "We are the only country forbidden by law to defend ourselves fully. How is that normal?" These voices grow louder each year. The government's dilemma. Since Abe's 2014 reinterpretation, Japan has expanded its defense role significantly, joint patrols with the U.S. new counter-strike missile doctrine, acquisition of F-35 fighters and Aegis destroyers, development of long-range missiles. Yet all of this exists in a legal gray zone, built on reinterpretations rather than constitutional clarity. Prime Minister Kishida's cabinet in 2025 faces a question that no post-war government has answered. Do we revise Article 9 or keep stretching it until it breaks? Political factions split. Reformists want a clear constitutional revision. Traditionalists want Article 9 preserved exactly as written. Pragmatists accept reinterpretation but reject revision. Nationalists want full remilitarization. Pacifists want to reduce military presence. No consensus, no stable majority, and behind every decision hangs one shadow. The quiet sentence MacArthur spoke in 1946. A sentence that gave Japan moral clarity, but not strategic certainty. Asia's geopolitical reality, the pressure tightens. The U.S.-China rivalry. Japan is now the most crucial U.S. ally in the Pacific. Washington relies on Japan for bases, missile defense, logistics, naval cooperation, intelligence. In private diplomatic cables, U.S. strategists express concern. Japan's constitutional limitations may hinder joint operations in a major conflict. Translation. If war breaks out, Japan might be legally barred from doing what the U.S. needs. China's response. Chinese state media frequently warns Japan, do not abandon pacifism. Do not return to militarism. Article 9 protects Asia. Critics argue China wants Japan to remain constrained, while China's own military grows at historic speed. South Korea and Taiwan. Both governments watch Japan carefully. South Korea fears Japanese militarization. Taiwan hopes for Japanese support against mainland China. Article 9 affects not just Japan's domestic politics, but the entire Pacific balance. The core question of 2025. Japan must now confront what it has avoided for decades. Was Article 9 meant to be permanent? Or was it a product of occupation that no longer fits reality? Supporters say Japan has lived in peace for 80 years. Japan avoided sending forces to foreign wars. Article 9 is admired globally as a symbol of restraint. Critics say Article 9 leaves Japan strategically exposed. The clause was imposed in 1946, not chosen freely. Modern warfare makes pure pacifism unrealistic. China and North Korea take advantage of Japan's limitations. Both sides are right. Both sides are wrong. And that is why Japan is paralyzed. For the first time since 1946, Japan truly faces the question MacArthur never imagined. Can a nation renounce war when the world refuses to renounce conflict? In 2025, politicians quote Article 9 in speeches. Protesters carry it on banners. Scholars argue about its original meaning. Younger voters debate it passionately on social media. But almost none of them know the truth behind its creation. It did not emerge from months of debate. It was not negotiated between two equal governments. It was not drafted by a committee of scholars. It began with a simple, quiet sentence, spoken in a Tokyo office by an American general while Japan lay in ruins. A sentence that said, Japan will renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. That sentence has shaped 8 decades of peace and 8 decades of political tension. And now, in 2025, Japan must finally answer the question left unresolved. Does that sentence still define Japan? Or must Japan define itself anew? A quiet voice in a room full of power. To understand the weight of Japan's current dilemma, we return to the moment when the entire trajectory of modern Japan was changed. Not by a battle, not by a treaty, not by a vote, but by a sentence. This scene has been reconstructed from GHQ internal memos, meeting summaries, testimonies recorded decades later, and documents declassified in the 1990s. The setting, Daiichi Building, Tokyo, early February 1946. A long rectangular table. Stacks of military reports, filing cabinets arranged with absolute order, typewriters clacking outside in the hallway. Inside the room stood MacArthur's top legal and political officers, men who were accustomed to the general's commanding presence, but not prepared for what he was about to say. General Courtney Whitney described the moment like this. MacArthur did not raise his voice. He did not pause. He simply stated it, as though it were the most natural idea in the world. MacArthur began by acknowledging the devastation of the war. He spoke without notes. He said, Japan has known war. Japan has tasted the bitterness of defeat. Let Japan now become the nation that leads the world in renouncing it. Silence. No one dared interrupt. Then came the sentence. The one that would enter the Constitution, the one that would define Article 9, the one that would divide Japan for generations. Japan will renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. The room froze. Whitney wrote, It was as though time stopped. Every officer leaned back. We had never heard anything like it. MacArthur continued, still in his calm, steady tone. No land forces, no sea forces, no air forces, no war potential of any kind. There were no dramatic hand gestures, no pounding of the table, no rhetorical flourish, just a quiet voice, delivering the most radical constitutional idea of the 20th century. Colonel Charles Cades later said, "I thought he must be joking." But MacArthur was deadly serious, and in that moment, MacArthur wasn't just reshaping Japan, he was reshaping Asia. He was reshaping what a defeated nation could become. Behind the calm demeanor was a calculated mind. MacArthur wanted to prevent the return of militarists, to avoid Soviet exploitation of Japan, to build a stable U.S.-Japan alliance, to create a moral legacy for a devastated nation, and to show the world a vision of peace that no other great power had offered. He chose a sentence that forced Japan to redefine itself, not through war, but through renunciation of it. It was radical, it was unprecedented, it was irreversible, or so MacArthur thought, because the world would eventually force Japan to reinterpret the sentence. He never intended to be reinterpreted, but on that morning in 1946, none of that mattered yet. In that moment, the future was being carved into law by the quiet voice of a single man. Japan did not simply adopt Article 9, Japan paid for it. To accept Article 9 in 1946 was to accept a kind of national vulnerability, unprecedented for a major power. Japan surrendered the right to declare war, the right to maintain armed forces, the right to possess war potential, the sovereign power exercised by every other nation on Earth. This was not symbolic. It was absolute, and Japan lived with the consequences. The vulnerability years, late 1940s, early 1950s. During these years, Japan had no military of any kind, no army, no navy, no air force, no coast guard equipped for war, no ability to defend itself independently. If a foreign power invaded Japan during that time, Japan would have fallen in days. Politicians in later decades accused the Americans of forcing this vulnerability, but at the time, the Japanese public accepted it. They wanted bread, not bullets, jobs, not battles, schools, not ships. Article 9 let Japan rebuild faster than any defeated nation in history. Economic miracle shielded by pacifism. By removing military spending, Japan's budget exploded with possibilities: rapid industrialization, infrastructure investment, educational reform, reconstruction of cities, technological R&D, world-leading manufacturing. Japan's economic miracle, 1950s to 1980s, was born from the financial freedom that pacifism provided. Economists often say Article 9 did not create Japan's economic miracle, but it made it possible. The moral identity of Japan. By the 1970s, Japan had transformed into something MacArthur never fully foresaw. A nation known globally not for conquest, but for craftsmanship, technology, efficiency, and peace. Japanese passports became some of the most trusted in the world. Japan entered international diplomacy with unprecedented soft power. Countries once devastated by Japan's invasion welcomed Japanese investment and development. Article 9 had become a symbol, or a diplomatic shield, and a moral reference point. But this peace had a price, a hidden tension that grew each year. Because a nation without full military sovereignty is a nation dependent on others, and dependence can turn to vulnerability. Throughout the 20th and early 21st century, governments tried repeatedly to revise Article 9. Every attempt failed. Not because the law was perfect, but because it had become a core part of Japanese identity. People protested not for militarism, but for memory. They carried signs saying, "My father died in the last war. No more." Article 9 protects our children. Peace is Japan's strength. Never again should we spill blood overseas. And each time politicians tried to modify Article 9, public outrage surged. But then, the world changed again, and the question returned with new urgency. How long can a pacifist clause survive in a militarized world? Japan's neighbors built forces Japan could not legally match. Missiles advanced beyond Article 9's imagination. Cyber warfare emerged. Space militarization expanded. Article 9 remained frozen in 1946. The world did not. By 2025, every debate on Article 9 eventually circles back to the same question. What did MacArthur really intend? Some scholars argue he wanted Japan permanently pacifist. Others insist he intended Japan to rearm eventually. Some interpret the sentence as moral, others as strategic. But the truth may be simpler. MacArthur wanted stability, peace, U.S. influence, a model for global disarmament, a check on Soviet expansion, a Japan that would never again drag Asia into war. He believed he could end a cycle of militarism by embedding peace into the nation's legal DNA. He chose a sentence so powerful that it survived war, occupation, the Cold War, political cycles, economic booms, and the rise of new military powers. Even now, Japan cannot escape it. Prime ministers fall because of it. Parliament dissolves over it. Generations argue about it. Families debate it at dinner tables. And in 2025, with the world more dangerous than at any point since 1945, Japan faces a decision MacArthur never imagined. Can Japan defend peace without abandoning the sentence that created it? What Japan sees when it looks at Article 9. There's a reason Article 9 is unlike any single law in the world. It is not simply a legal clause. It is not merely a relic of occupation. It is something far deeper, something carved into Japan's identity during its most vulnerable moment. For some, Article 9 is a mirror of shame, a reminder of the destruction Japan unleashed during the war. They see it as atonement, a pledge never to repeat the past. For others, Article 9 is a mirror of pride, a symbol of how Japan transformed from empire to peaceful global power. They see it as proof that nations can change. And for a growing number, Article 9 is a mirror of danger. A reminder that idealism cannot stop missiles, cannot intercept drones, cannot deter aggression. Each Japanese citizen sees something different in that mirror. But the mirror itself remains the same, unmoving, unchanged, unresolved. For decades, Japan survived by delicately balancing two truths. Truth number one, Japan renounce war forever. Truth number two, Japan must defend itself in a dangerous world. These two truths now collide, not philosophically, not academically, not in courtrooms, but in the real world, in the sonar blips of submarines off Okinawa, in the contrails of unknown aircraft near Hokkaido, in the flash of North Korean missiles cutting across the sky, in the cyber attacks targeting Tokyo's power grid, In the satellite imagery of carriers moving through contested waters, reality is forcing Japan to confront a question that Article 9 has avoided for 80 years. A question not of law, but of survival. Can peace exist without the means to defend it? It is a question with no easy answer. Politicians debate it. Generals whisper about it behind closed doors. Scholars argue on television. Protesters march with signs quoting the Constitution word for word. But no one can deny what every Japanese citizen feels. The world of 2025 is not the world of 1946. MacArthur likely never imagined that a single sentence spoken in a quiet conference room would become the most defining political fault line in Japan for nearly a century. He likely never imagined the Cold War, North Korean nuclear tests, Chinese missiles, cyber warfare, gray zone naval tactics, drone swarms, space-based weapons. He imagined rebuilding a broken nation. He imagined giving Japan stability and moral renewal. He imagined preventing another Pacific War. And in many ways, he succeeded. But there is another truth hidden in declassified memos. MacArthur believed that if the world followed Japan's example, global disarmament could become possible. He saw Article 9 not just as a legal clause, but as a model for humanity. He said privately, "Let Japan be the vanguard of a new path." But the world did not follow, and now, Japan stands alone, carrying the ideal he hoped would spread. The contradiction is painful. Japan carries the burden of global peace in a world that refuses to be peaceful. And yet, Japan has kept its promise. For 80 years, no constitution lasts forever unchanged. No nation survives without adapting. No legal document written in 1946 can perfectly describe the threats of 2025. Article 9 is more than text. It is a living struggle between past and future, fear and hope, memory and survival, and Japan now stands at a crossroads. Path 1. Keep Article 9. Exactly as it is, Japan remains the world's only nation that has permanently renounced war, a moral beacon, a global symbol, but also restricted, dependent, and vulnerable. Path 2. Revise Article 9. Japan gains full sovereignty over its defense. The SDF becomes a constitutional army. Japan can deter aggression more strongly, but also potential backlash or regional fear and loss of a moral identity held for 80 years. Path 3. Maintain Article 9, but continue reinterpretation. Japan keeps the peace clause, but bends it to fit modern threats. This is Japan's current path, but it grows more unstable each year. Whichever path Japan chooses, it will carry the weight of decades of sacrifice, memory, and uncertainty, and none of those paths can escape the sentence that started it all. Picture the room again. Dai-ichi Building, winter of 1946. Tokyo still smoldering from firestorms, soldiers limping home, families searching rubble for lost relatives, a nation broken in body and spirit. Into this devastation, an American general spoke softly, delivering a sentence that would become the heartbeat of modern Japan. He did not shout it. He did not declare it to the world. He did not imagine that it would echo for 70, 80, maybe even 100 years. but it did. One quiet sentence became the anchor of a new national identity and the spark of endless political struggle. Today, in 2025, the world has changed in ways MacArthur could never imagine. But Japan still carries his words, still debates their meaning, still divides over their consequences, still builds its future upon a sentence born in defeat, still wonders if that promise is a blessing or a chain. And the question that hangs over Japan now is the same question that future generations will continue asking: was MacArthur's quiet sentence a vision or a warning? Only time will tell. But this much is certain. As long as Article 9 exists, as long as Japan confronts a dangerous world with a promise made in a ruined city, the story is not over. The sentence lives on. The debate lives on. Japan's struggle between peace and survival lives on. And the world watches to see whether that quiet sentence will continue to define Japan, or whether Japan will one day define itself.